My name is Jessie Ace. I'm part of a group of enabled warriors that you've probably never heard of. We're fighting back against our invisible illness and taking the dis out of disability. We don't give sympathy to our symptoms. They enable us to be the warrior that we are. If you ask doctors and nurses, they'd say what we're doing is impossible. But pushing the limits of our conditions is something that we have to break through every single day. See, we push the limits. We are mentally strong, and we can do anything. The question is, how far can we push those limits? This podcast will give you the answers. I'm Jessie Ace, and this is the Disabled to Enabled podcast. Hey Warriors, thanks for joining me for another episode of the Disabled to Enabled podcast with me, your host, Jessie Ace. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends at Beekeepers Naturals, natural health products created by bees. Their products are so good that I've not had a cold the entire winter. Did you know that without bees, we'd have no coffee? Crazy. Check out mmini.me/bees and use code WARRIOR for 10% off today, or click the link in the show notes. By clicking this link, by the way, Beekeepers Naturals will give back to the Disabled to Enabled podcast. Enabled Warriors, our next guest on the show is a 28-year-old patient advocate living with the rare metabolic bone disorder XLH. That stands for X-linked hypophosphatemia. I hope I said that right. I've been practicing that all morning. Despite being diagnosed in early childhood, Sally was 25 before she ever met or spoke to patients with the same condition or discovered organisations able to help her. Since then, she's determined to make sure that no other young person living with XLH or other chronic conditions and physical differences have to struggle in isolation as she did. She has since gone on to become the Young Person's Project Officer at the Metabolic Support UK, an umbrella patient organisation for inherited metabolic disorders, and is a volunteer for the XLH UK and the International XLH Alliance. Oh my goodness, how cool. She is also an active member of the European Patients Forum Youth Group. Oh, that's amazing. Today's guest is particularly interested in changing the ways that society views and treats people with physical differences and the support and acceptance available to those living with chronic illnesses and uncommon symptoms. Enabled Warriors, please help me in welcoming the most amazing person today, the fabulous Sally Hatton, everybody! Woo! Hey, how you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. I'm good. How are you?
Awesome. I'm great, thanks.
Good.
So let's get straight into the first part of our interview today with Sally. This section focuses on the actual diagnosis and everything kind of before what happened. Listening out for part 2 to find out how she coped and thrived afterward. Then in part 3, you can look out for Sally's answers to the super quick secrets round. Let's get straight in with part 1. Can you tell us about your actual diagnosis? So you were 18 months old. This is crazy. How did doctors know that something was wrong at that age?
Yeah, so one of the most common symptoms with XLH is a bowing of the legs and a difference in the way that someone walks, because it causes bone weakness. So when babies start to walk, the pressure of the body weight on the legs causes that difference. So when I started to walk, my mum noticed and just thought something seems different. And she mentioned it to a health visitor who pretty much dismissed it and said that it was just over-worried parents or something called a baby's bow, which is common in a lot of children starting to walk. So she kind of put it to the back of her mind but wasn't quite convinced. And then they had another paediatrician appointment and they raised it again, and a nurse agreed with my mum and just said, it doesn't seem as it should be. So they immediately sort of sent me off for tests, which I think was quite scary for my parents because they just thought it would be something minor. There was a lot of different conditions discussed that it could have been, and then we were really lucky because one of the other more unusual symptoms is a thickening of the wrists, and one paediatrician noticed that and had heard about XLH and knew that was a symptom, so she sort of raised that flag, and then we got that diagnosis, which is fantastic, and it was reasonably quick as rare disease diagnoses go. I think we had a little bit of problem then in getting the right treatment. So the hospital sort of knew to start me on a supplement, but they weren't quite sure the right dosage. And then again, I guess it was just a kind of stroke of luck. So my mum saw someone that she knew vaguely, sort of out and out shopping, who had the same symptoms. And she just said, do you mind if I ask you, because we've got a new baby, she has a new diagnosis and we're kind of struggling to get the right help. and she let us know that there was an expert paediatrician in Manchester where we live, and to get a referral. So yeah, we were lucky that we did, and he was fantastic and looked after me up until I moved into adult services.
That's amazing. So can you tell us a little bit more about what XLH actually is in more detail?
Mm-hmm. So phosphate is a mineral that we all get from food and drink and things like that, and it's absorbed by the body. And when your body has enough phosphate, it releases a hormone which is called FGF23, and that works in two ways. So it firstly blocks that absorption process, and then it diverts any excess phosphate out to be wasted. And when you have XLH, you produce too much of that hormone, so it means that your body is essentially throwing away phosphate that it actually needs. So it results in bones being demineralized, in being quite stiff and achy and painful. In adults, there's also a risk of stress fractures. As I say, bowing of the legs is really common in children and all people really with XLH to different degrees. It can cause a lot of dental problems due to weakened enamel, usually short stature, and also potentially differences to skull structure and things like that. So quite a range, and it's not always within a specific pattern. So you can get quite different people with XLH, or you can have XLH within a family and it will affect different members differently. So it is inherited, but it can also occur spontaneously, and that's what happened with me. So I would pass it on to my children, but there's no family history of the condition for us.
That's crazy, isn't it? And wow. So how do you kind of get around that? Like, what kind of medications are you on at the moment?
Yeah, so I take a supplement 4 times a day, and I'm monitored twice a year and have blood tests twice a year just to check my phosphate levels. So the way that I usually describe it is it's kind of like filling a leaky bucket. So you can't plug the leak, but you're trying to top it up. And you can actually have a toxic level of phosphate. So you can't just kind of chuck a load of phosphate at the problem and it will fix it, because then you could make yourself ill in a different way. So it is kind of trying to find the right balance of how much your body can hold at any time, but it won't be as much as somebody that doesn't have the condition.
Gosh, that's crazy, isn't it? Wow. So so tell us about when you actually learned about what you had at the age of 25. So you kind of had this condition for your whole life.
Hmm.
Did you not know about it until the age of 25? That's crazy.
Yeah, it was quite strange. I think in a weird way, I was really lucky with my doctor being such an expert, and he was so good at getting me to take my medication and keep to my medication, because it's not particularly pleasant because it's in a drink and it just doesn't taste very nice, and trying to keep up with it through the day. And my parents were really supportive and just kind of treated me as if I was no different and I was just the same as everybody else and I could do anything that I wanted. So I think in a lot of ways, I didn't really think about it too much myself. I think that probably changed when I was a teenager, and it started to affect me a lot more, and particularly my mental health, and realizing that I was different and I did look different and I did walk differently and things like that. And I really struggled with that side of things. And that's when I had my first surgery. But information wise, it just, I suppose I felt because it was so rare and no one really knew about it and no one really understood it, I just almost assumed that the information wasn't out there, or that the community wasn't out there, because I kind of felt like, why would anybody bother with this one random condition that just happens? I think when I got older, I did start to think about it more. And after I'd kind of recovered from some of the mental health problems and I was thinking about ways that I could have a more positive relationship with it, I did do a bit of Googling, and the information was just awful. It was really medical. And I tell this story quite a lot, but I found one page that described it as insidious, which is just such a horrible word.
It's not what you want to read.
No, like it's literally the name of a horror film. I just remember thinking, I don't know if I can keep reading this literature that just focuses so much on the symptomatic side and the negative side. And I just thought, we've always tried to deal with it day by day in the family and just get through. So I kind of thought I might just almost hide away, I guess, just close the tab, pretend it didn't happen. And I think so. I think in some ways, because I didn't have enough information, it was hard to know what to tell people. And that maybe made it easier because I didn't think about it too much, and I would just kind of say, oh, I have this weird bone thing, or I have a bone problem, or I have to take this medication. And I never really, until I knew someone for a while, I maybe never really kind of gave everyone the whole picture.
Yeah.
So sometimes people would make insensitive comments, and then about the way that I looked or the way that I walked, and I would say it's because I have a condition, or people would ask about my medication. But it was probably, only people that I was really close to that I would feel able to open up about the wider impact and how it affected me emotionally, or how sometimes it is quite tiring or can be a little bit painful. And I think letting people into that vulnerability was quite hard.
Yeah.
Whereas now, because it's work, it almost gives me a much easier way to speak to people about it. But then it also means that it comes up a lot sooner. So when people ask, what do you do for a job? And I explain, and then they say, how did you get into that? And I think, oh, I'll tell you about XLH now. Whereas before, it might not have been kind of the first conversation that I had with someone.
Yeah.
But I think it is scary for everyone, and especially when it's something rare, because you don't know how people are going to react, and they don't often have prior knowledge of how to approach it, I guess.
Yeah, they're also not very tactful in the way that they do approach it either.
Not always. Yeah, I've had mixed reactions. I've had people who are very careful about it and very kind of sensitive about it, and will ask me if I'm comfortable talking about certain things, or will kind of try and make it so that I don't have to speak about things if I don't want to. But then I remember once I stood up, and usually when I stand up I am quite stiff, and someone just came over and went, "Are you okay? You're limping." And I just thought, how insensitive. You don't know why, and it's not the nicest way to describe it, but it was just kind of, sometimes it's intrusive, and sometimes it's sensitive. And I think having a good or bad reaction can really impact how you feel about telling the next person.
It's funny, isn't it? It's funny. And the best one that I always get is, oh, you've got MS. Oh, my grandma's sister's brother's uncle's dog's got that. And you're like, right. And then they're like, oh, and they died. And you're like, oh, thanks.
Oh, thanks.
Send me that.
Yeah.
I find it quite funny. Oh my gosh. So can you tell us a little bit about the procedures that you've had done? I mean, they sounded pretty horrific. So your first one was like at age 17, right?
Yeah. So I think for me, because the mental health side of things was really difficult at that point, and a lot of that was centered around the way that I looked and having the bow-leggedness, because I don't want to sound dismissive, but I think it is just really common at that age group. You're just so much more self-conscious, and I was so much more self-aware, and I really struggled. And I spoke to my doctor and said I either needed some kind of psychological help almost, or some intervention to address the symptoms. And it is a reasonably common procedure in people with XLH, usually in childhood, which I hadn't been offered, because really, compared to other XLH cases, my symptoms are quite mild, and I did react to treatment really well. But I think it was just something that I was really struggling to accept. So it's not maybe for the squeamish, but it was quite a big procedure. So they kind of surgically break both tibias, which is a lower leg bone, and I think they move part of the bone to a different position. I don't even fully understand it now, and kind of put that back in position with quite a big metal plate. So I made that decision when I was 17 that was what I wanted to do. And weirdly, it was kind of really positive for me, because it was addressing a symptom that I was really struggling with. But it was hard. I was in hospital for a couple of weeks in a wheelchair, then on a Zimmer frame, and then on crutches, and doing a lot of physio. And that was great, and we were really pleased with the results. And the plan at that point was no more surgery, because it was all in and sorted. And over the next 4 years, I had complications with both of the plates. So they both came out on separate instances. So the first one came out and we thought, great, no more surgery. Then the second one had to come out and we thought, great, no more surgery. Everything's gone in, everything's come out, like we're done. And then I'd had a scan which showed a weakness in my bone, which is quite common. And we kept an eye on it with my doctor for, I think, a few years. And it was just kind of, we'll monitor it, but it's fine. But they did say, if you ever feel anything in that region of the bone that feels weird, to let us know. And a couple of years ago, I walked into a radiator or some clothes that were hanging on a radiator, and it hit the corner of it, really specifically hit this point. And I got a bit of an ache, and I thought, not sure about this. Left it for a little while because I get aches and pains anyway, just to confirm that it definitely was a new pain. And that turned out to be a fracture. So that was kind of, that was really out of the blue, because it was just a random injury. And then I had surgery for that, which got quite complicated. So where it was and the shape of the bone, because of my XLH, made it really hard for them to operate on. So they were able to secure it with a plate, but it was quite difficult. And then again, I was in hospital for a few weeks, which was unexpected. And then the recovery was really long. So touch wood, that's all done. As I say, we keep saying no more surgery, and then something happens, but I'm being careful and hopefully monitoring that and having my medication. I should avoid them for now, at least.
Oh, gosh, it sounds just crazy. So it's let me just get this right. So it's really easy to break a bone and things?
Yes, it can depend on whereabouts, because usually when I describe it and people say, oh, you have soft bones, and it's not quite soft bones, or people say you have brittle bones and it's not quite brittle bones. I think they're kind of just tired bones is an easy way to describe it. So you can develop these areas that are weaker, and unfortunately it was for me that when I bumped it, it was right in that spot. But usually, as I say, with taking my medication, my bones are kind of a pretty reasonable strength. They're just not great. But it would take a pretty decent knock to do anything, but I am definitely a bit more at risk, I'd say.
You have to be a bit more careful about Man, what do you think was the hardest part of your illness to accept?
I think the fact that it's progressive and not quite knowing where that's going to go. And as I say, when we had that surgery, and I wasn't even aware that you could develop fractures, and I was very much in control of XLH, and then just having such a minor thing happen and suddenly be out of work for months and in hospital for weeks, and that was a shock, because you just don't know how bad it's going to be. And I guess, that unpredictability. So some days are better than others, and some things I can do and other things I can't do, but it's not something that you can really easily control. And I think trying to find peace with the fact that I can manage it and have a decent relationship with it, but I don't always quite know what it's going to do next, I think is the hardest thing.
Unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh. Okay, so that's it for part 1. In the next part, we're going to be discussing the amazing things that Sally has done since her diagnosis. So warriors, look out for part 2. And if there's anything that we've spoken about so far that you can relate to, then please tell us in the comments and let's have a chat. And remember to follow and subscribe wherever you're listening today. Are you ready to fight back against your chronic illness and go from being disabled to enabled? Do you want to be an enabled warrior? Someone who is brave, strong and confident, and someone who is ready to find a way to achieve awesome things despite a diagnosis. This is your invitation. Check out DISabledtoENabled.com for articles and reviews to find out how you can become enabled too. If you think this podcast is better than sleeping in on Sundays, tickle that subscribe or follow button. Want to ask your questions to future guests? Make sure to share the episode with someone who needs some inspiration. Join the Enabled Warriors tribe on Facebook and look out for our question posts. Before we go, check out DISabledtoENabled on Instagram and stay enabled.